Good afternoon and welcome to this addition to the ISCA ICAN webinar series for the end of the school year. Today we are talking schools and suicide, how you can help in the time of 13 Reasons Why. And today we have Sarah Knox from the Crisis Center in Johnson County. Sarah is a training coordinator and holds a master's degree in social work and is going to lead the discussion today. I want to thank Sarah for joining us. Before I turn it over to Sarah, just some housekeeping. We're going to keep everyone on mute. We are recording the webinar. If you have questions, go ahead and type those into the question box and we will get those answered during the presentation. And also keep your chat box open. There may be some interaction. Sarah will go over that during her presentation. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sarah. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a really important topic, and so I'm excited to talk about it. I want to say a couple things as well before I get started. If you are participating in this webinar and you have questions, you can feel free to type the question whenever it pops up in your mind, and I'll pay attention and come back to the question as soon as I have time. And also, I'm used to presenting in person, and I PowerPoint for this, but it's still a relatively thin PowerPoint. There aren't a lot of slides. So if you are watching this later as a recording, it might not be terribly interesting to look at, but I think that the audio part is going to be very interesting, so you can kind of treat it as a podcast and do other things while you're listening to it. And you won't miss out on anything. So, okay, so with 13 Reasons Why out right now and just releasing its second season, this is becoming an issue that's much more in the public eye. And it's possible that it's now becoming easier to talk about it in schools, even though this has been an issue that has existed in schools for a long time. So first I want to talk about teenagers and suicide and how they differ from adults. So I don't know if you guys know how many people have thoughts in a given year, but there have been a number of surveys asking people to report themselves anonymously, and it's very, very consistent with both adults and teenagers. For adults, about 1 out of 20 people have thoughts of suicide in a given year. For teenagers thinking about suicide, it rises to 3 out of 20. So teenagers are much, much more likely to think about suicide than adults in a given year. It's also a very high cause of death. Depending on the state, in some places, suicide even outranks accidents in terms of the cause of death. So then we need to look at who is at risk of suicide. What things do you need to pay attention to? And it's not necessarily the people that you would stereotypically believe. Certainly, if people are expressing signs of depression, if they get into trouble a lot, those are normal warning signs. But there's others as well that may not be as obvious or may not fit exactly your stereotype of kids that need help. So I've broken this into 2 categories. One is suicidal desire and the other is suicidal capability. So for suicidal desire, the things that can increase whether or not a person is thinking about suicide is if they have feelings of hopelessness, if they believe that they are a burden on other people, especially their family, if they feel like their family is better off without them, that can lead to thoughts of suicide. Isolation or being cut off from a group. This could be bullying. This could be if somebody has been isolated for a long time. It could also mean losing a social group that they already have. Kids who have moved, kids who have been, like, say, kicked out of a particular team. Which leads to the next one, public humiliation can be a big trigger. And also students who have extremely high standards for themselves can also be at higher risk of suicide, especially if they aren't able to meet those high standards, like failing to get into the college of their choice, things like that. So the things that can contribute to a person's suicidal capability are losing someone they know to suicide, a friend, a family member, somebody else in their school. If they engage in intentional self-injury or self-harm, which most stereotypically we think of cutting, which we aren't always able to see which people self-injure in terms of cutting. There's a stereotype that exists that people cut for attention, but most of the people that we talk to at the crisis center who self-injure actually go to great lengths to hide the scars from it because they don't want people to know, they don't want the stigma associated with it. So you might not see cut marks, but you might see a person always wearing long sleeves, even in the summer. And that could be a sign that they are hiding scars from self-injury or from a past suicide attempt. Cutting is also not the only form of self-injury. Things like punching walls is also a form of self-injury that's more common for boys than girls. Another category under suicidal capability is whether or not they have access to lethal methods. So this would be, do they have access to a large number of pills? Do they have access to guns? Guns is the most dangerous because the percentage of people who attempt suicide using a gun who survive is extraordinarily small. Whereas the percentage of people who attempt suicide by overdose, most of those people survive. So if a student has guns in their home, that puts them at a much higher risk. So now the reason that I divided this into these two different categories is because the category on the left is increasing the person's thoughts, the likelihood that they'll have thoughts of suicide. And so you can picture this as sort of like the water level of like pain that they're dealing with in their life is rising. So we've got this water level on the left, and then we have a dam that's holding it back. And on the right is where they would get to a suicide attempt. So the more things that are happening in that left-hand column, the more hopeless they feel, the more they feel like they're a burden on others, the more they feel cut off from people that they care about. Those are things that will, oh dear, I started going backwards instead of forward. Okay, those are things that will raise the risk of suicide, that raise that water level. But all of us also have this sort of internal dam that prevents us from acting on those thoughts. But if you've been exposed to another suicide, that makes the thought of suicide more accessible to you. You can picture yourself making that attempt. People who have already injured themselves, it's almost like they've practiced taking down that wall that would prevent them from otherwise hurting themselves. And access to lethal methods also makes it much easier for them to make that attempt. So basically those things in the suicidal capability category, those things are lowering the dam so that then it's possible that the things from the other side will overwhelm the person and they will end up making a suicide attempt. So So you may be wondering what you can do to prevent suicide. And also, as people working in schools, you don't see kids all the time. You have a lot of work to do. You are limited in how much time that you have that you can pay attention to a kid's behavior or even have time to talk to them. So I have a story that illustrates how important even a small amount of time can be. So in Great Britain in the 50s and 60s, they used coal gas in all of their gas lines to power their stoves, to heat their homes. You may be questioning what this has to do with suicide. I promise I'm getting there. Okay. So during that same period of time in Great Britain, the #1 cause of death by suicide was putting your head in the oven, blowing out the pilot light and sitting there and inhaling the fumes from the coal gas until you asphyxiated from carbon monoxide poisoning. Then Great Britain switched from coal gas to natural gas. Natural gas has a much lower percentage of carbon monoxide. So even if you inhale it for a long time, you may get dizzy, you may get nauseous, but you won't die. Before this change was made, about 1/3 of all of the suicide deaths in Great Britain were caused by putting your head in the oven. After this change happened, the suicide rate in Great Britain dropped by almost exactly 1/3, and it has stayed there ever since. So think about that for a minute. This was not something that took away the ability for people to kill themselves. They could still tie a noose. They could still walk down to the corner drugstore and buy a bunch of pills. The difference is those other methods would take more time. And by the time they thought about a different method, by the time they took the time to figure out how to do it, the suicidal crisis had already passed. And that might even be just 20 minutes that it would have taken to find a different method. So the key that I take away from this, and that I find incredibly helpful when doing this work on crisis hotlines, is that we can actually make a very, very huge difference in a person's life, even if we're only talking them for 20 minutes. Because for the majority of people who make a suicide attempt, that's all the time that it takes to get them out of that worst point into a more stable train of thought. Now, that's not all you have to do. That's not the last step, is taking 20 minutes with them. But I hope that that does give you more confidence in what you can accomplish, even if you don't have a lot of time one-on-one with a person. So what you can do is ask directly if you're worried about somebody having suicidal thoughts. Once you get that answer, you can listen to what's causing those suicidal thoughts non-judgmentally. You can offer the person support, and you can follow up with them the next day, or even later the same day. And I want to go into each of these in greater depth as well. So when asking about suicide, a lot of people are afraid to ask about suicide because they have this idea that asking about suicide will put the idea in the person's head. Now, I just showed you 3 out of 20 teenagers in the United States thinks about suicide in a given year. I can guarantee you far fewer people than that were asked about suicide. Thoughts of suicide are incredibly common. If you are looking at a student and you think there's enough warning signs that you wonder whether or not they're thinking of suicide, if it occurred to you, it definitely occurred to them. So you won't be putting the idea in their head. And in fact, there's research that shows that just having a conversation with somebody about suicide lowers the risk that the person will make the attempt. So this leads to another common misconception. A lot of people say that if somebody talks about suicide, they aren't going to attempt it. So we disagree with this. And there's some statistics that also both support and belie this idea. First of all, the vast majority of people who talk about suicide don't make an attempt. That's true. There's a reason that people say that. Suicide attempts are fortunately relatively rare. So if you look at the entire pie of people who have attempted suicide, or excuse me, who have talked about suicide, only about 5% of those have actually gone on to make a suicide attempt, 5 to 10%. However, of the people who have attempted suicide, more than 95% of them talked about it before they attempted it. So if you want to prevent suicide, you absolutely have to pay attention to the people who talk about it. Almost everybody who attempts suicide talked about it at some point. So we have to take it seriously. Even when people joke about suicide, it may be that they are making that joke as an attempt to test the waters to see how people react. Because there's a fear of if people overreact, that they won't be able to handle it emotionally, that they'll call the cops, that they'll tell everybody, and things will be bad in that way. There's also the risk that people will underreact, that people will say, oh, you're not serious. Your feelings aren't that bad, get over it. And both of those are really painful experiences for somebody who's already thinking about suicide. So they may be trying to test the water to see how people will react. In fact, something that, a comparison that I often make is that talking about suicide for somebody who's thinking about suicide is a little bit like flirting. Bear with me. So when you're interested in somebody and you want to ask them out on a date, it's really scary to be the person to make the first move, to be the person to put yourself out there and say, hey, I'm interested in you. Do you want to go out with me? So we don't just walk up to somebody and ask them out of the blue. What we do instead is we flirt. We strike up a conversation. We smile at the person. We tell a joke and see if they laugh. And these are all intended to test the water, to see how they react to us, to see if we think we have a shot at what we really want. Now, if that person that we're flirting with turns around and asks us out, we feel completely relieved that we didn't have to be the person to put ourselves on the line and take that risk. The same is true with suicide. When somebody is thinking about suicide, they're terrified that other people are going to judge them, other people are going to reject them, other people are going to overreact. So if you are willing to take that first move and ask the person about suicide, just ask, you know, you seem so depressed. Have you been thinking about suicide lately? Or anything else that gets directly at the point. You're taking that pressure off of them. You're communicating to them that it's okay, you're going to be calm, you're not going to overreact, you're willing to listen, and it'll all be okay. I've asked this question of hundreds of people, and I've never had anybody get upset or offended for me asking, even though I have had people tell me no, they weren't thinking about it. Most of the people that I have asked this of respond with relief because they finally are able to talk about it. There are bad ways to ask about suicide. There are very, very few. In general, when you bring up the topic it's beneficial, regardless of how you talk about it. However, there are some ways that you can ask that discourage a positive response, a truthful, honest response. So if you were to say, are you thinking of doing something crazy? You're not thinking of suicide, are you? Those are ways of asking that indicate to the person that you aren't willing to talk about it, or that you might not be able to handle it if they did talk about it. So show that you're comfortable with the topic by being willing to talk about it directly. So that brings us on to the second point, which is listening non-judgmentally. Finding out that somebody's thinking about suicide is not the end of the story. Find out what it is that got them to this point. Being able to talk to somebody who isn't judging them is kind of a rare gift to give somebody. When we are stuck in our own heads, our problems seem much bigger. The solutions that are maybe not good solutions might seem like good ideas in our head until we talk about them out loud. So giving somebody that platform to talk without being interrupted, without being judged, can make a very, very big difference all by itself. Then when it comes to other support, I am going to plug the crisis line here because we do get a lot of teenagers. So, and actually I didn't make a slide about this specifically, but I want to be able to show you guys the website. So the website, iowacrisischat.org, I can show you what it looks like as well. This is a site where anybody, they don't have to be teenagers, can come to this site and open up a chat with us and talk to one of our trained volunteers. Teenagers are very, very hesitant to reach out on phone lines. You may have noticed that teenagers don't talk on phones very much. However, they do come on chat a lot. Of all of the people who visit Crisis Chat, the median age is 21, so half of the people who reach out for us to help are under the age of 21. And between 50 and 80% of the people who reach out to us are thinking about suicide. So we do have a lot of experience talking to teenagers who are thinking about suicide. The other good thing from teenagers' point of view when it comes to using this site is that it doesn't necessarily mean that anybody else in their life is going to find out that they had these suicidal thoughts. We've talked to people who are even sitting in the same room with other family members, but they're on their laptop, and so nobody knows what they're doing. And really, they're having a suicidal crisis, and they needed to talk to somebody. We have a number of like brochures and magnets and stuff that we can send to your school if you're interested. We don't charge for that. Just shoot me an email, let me know, and I'll send you anything you want. One thing that I heard from a doctor's office that we work with was that it was really helpful to put that stuff in the bathroom because people are afraid of being seen taking that kind of information, taking a card or a pamphlet or something that says Crisis Chat on it. But if you can put things like that in the bathroom, then they can take it without anybody seeing them. So this is an excellent resource. Also, the resources across Iowa vary depending on which mental health region you're in. So the different mental health regions have different services they provide. Iowa Crisis Chat, it doesn't matter, you can access that from anywhere. But it is also worth looking into your area to find out if your area offers mobile crisis outreach, because that is another thing that can help. If a student needs to talk to somebody and you don't have anybody in the school who's prepared to have a conversation with somebody who might be feeling suicidal, if your region offers it, you can call the region and ask them to send a mobile crisis counselor to the school to talk to the student there. I know that's something that's offered in the East Central Iowa region. I'm not sure how many regions it's offered in across the state, but that's worth looking into. I'm also interested in hearing from you guys who are attendees right now, what is the normal response that you guys have if you are talking to somebody that you think might be thinking about suicide? There aren't a whole lot of you in this webinar right now, so I'd love it if all of you could leave a brief message in the chat saying what your policy is if you identify as a student who might be suicidal. All right, I'm not sure if anybody's going to type a message or not. So I'm going to continue. So one thing that we have heard frequently from people who have come to Iowa Crisis Chat to talk is that they're afraid.
We did get one message.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. What did you get? I'm not seeing it on my screen.
They put it in a question box instead of the chat box, which is fine.
Okay.
At my district, we talk with the students, and once we get a feeling that they are truly suicidal, we contact parents. That's
excellent.
One policy that has been shared.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so what I was going to say about this is that we frequently hear from students who are in high school, sometimes even middle school, who are afraid to talk to counselors at their school because they're afraid of having the police called, of having their parents be told, or having other teachers be told. So that is worth reviewing what your school's policies are, especially on telling other teachers, because if it's not 100% necessary for the other people to know in order to protect that student's safety, if you tell other teachers once, it might prevent any other students from being willing to tell you if they're thinking about suicide. Yeah. Also, when it comes to whether or not to try to send a student to a hospital or try to have the police get involved, ultimately, the biggest question for us is whether or not that person is at high risk today. Some people have very intense thoughts of suicide, but they don't have a specific plan that they're thinking of. They aren't planning on doing it today, or they're just very willing to talk, and just talking is helping them a lot. For us, our standard in trying to get somebody to the hospital, even if they don't necessarily want to go, is if they have a plan and they have the ability to act on that plan and they can't be talked out of it and they're planning to do it today, imminently. It is also possible for you to call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. We're one of the people that answer the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, but we aren't the only ones in Iowa. There's also Foundation 2, which is out of Cedar Rapids, but it's an 800 number, so it's free. And also, if any one of the centers that answers that number is busy at the time, it'll automatically roll over to the next closest center. So you should never have a call go unanswered when you call. And we have also had schools call us with a student in the office so that the student can just talk to us while they're in the office or talk to us with a counselor at the same time. So that's also a really good way to get help for somebody. So I have a one-page handout that I'm going to send to Britt to send on to everybody. I didn't have it ready right in this moment to be able to give to you guys right now. But it has more details on these specific ways that you can help somebody, but it's still very, very brief. So if you have teachers or parents that have concerns, you can print out this one-page handout and offer it to them so that they have some idea of what to do as well. I also thought that it would be important to share with you guys, there's a couple of suicide postvention toolkits. So if there is a suicide in your community and you want to know what is the best way to respond as your school, I will include this as well for you guys. And actually, Britt, is there a way that I can share these links right now through the webinar so people can copy them from their home computers?
If you send me the PowerPoint, I will link that with the recording, but you can also type those links into the chat or just send them to me and I can include them in an email to everyone.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah. So I also wanted to impress upon everybody the importance of following up. Research has been done on calls to National Suicide Prevention Hotline, as well as even visits to doctors' offices. And when a suicide intervention is done, the person's risk of attempting suicide reduces dramatically, and it also reduces dramatically more if there's some kind of follow-up the next day, because it shows that person that you genuinely care, that it wasn't just a help them out and then move on situation. We still have a lot of time, and I also have a lot of stories. This is the first time that I've specifically talked to school counselors, and so I would like to know from all of you, and Britt, I'd love to hear from you too if you know of the types of questions that people normally ask. I want to know what's helpful for you guys to know.
So please take a minute to think about that question and type in your own questions into the question box. As far as my knowledge, from discussions that I have had with school counselors surrounding this topic, it's been limited, I will admit, but I think the most helpful is just starting out with where to start, warning signs, or, you know, how can you maybe look for the warning signs in students before they're saying
Right.
help. I think that's something that school counselors definitely would benefit from, just in terms of what they can see day to day, what are the warning signs. Other questions would be, you mentioned that some students may fear talking to a school counselor because they're afraid of the authorities or their parents being told. Do you have a recommendation on what you think districts should look at when thinking about policies? I know you mentioned, you know, considering what the school policies are. Do you have professional recommendations for considerations that should be made in terms of next steps once a school official is aware of an issue? So I think we could start with those two areas and then see what other questions come in from our attendees.
Excellent, excellent. So when I do in-person trainings with people, I ask people to brainstorm all the ways that they believe, or all the ways that they've heard that you can tell somebody might be at risk for suicide before they've told you. You know, what are the warning signs that somebody's thinking about suicide? And most people, when they generate a list of what they think the warning signs are, they're almost exactly the same as what experts say the warning signs are. Because ultimately, we talk about these things a lot. The students who seem sad, the students who will flip their emotions quickly from one day to another, teenagers who get in trouble a lot, teenagers who are withdrawing from their family or friends, or who have problems with substances, who have mental health diagnoses. These are all things that are easy for us to list as possible risk factors. The thing is that for any individual student, they could have one of these risk factors, they could have a lot of these risk factors, but even if somebody has a lot of these risk factors, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are thinking about suicide. And even if the person doesn't have any risk factors that are obvious to you, it doesn't necessarily mean they aren't thinking about suicide. And so what I think is the most important thing, and this is something that we also train our volunteers here on, is to trust your gut. If something feels off about somebody, ask them, especially if you've seen a change in their mood or their behavior. That can be very indicative that something is wrong. And yeah, just really trust your gut. As far as policy goes, that's a much more complex question. I'm not an expert on school policy. I do know that they discuss policy in the two websites that I mentioned that talk about suicide in schools. Specifically, each of these are talking about if there is a suicide in the community, but they also talk about school policies and how to address these things in general. And since those were written by people who do work regularly in school, I think they'll be able to better address the policy aspect of the question. But I do think it's a really good question, and I think that it's really important for school counselors to talk about this with each other, because I'm a master social worker and we have our own standards of ethics, and we have conversations about ethics where we talk about new things that have come up and how we can deal with that, and talking to each other about those things really helps us a lot. And therefore, having school counselors talk to other school counselors about what they've encountered, especially as technology and entertainment are moving so quickly. What worked 10 years ago might not be appropriate anymore, especially with students being able to text each other while they're still at school. Somebody might leave your office and 10 minutes later there's 30 kids who know what you said to that student because that student just texted everybody. So it's definitely the kind of thing that needs more conversation, that I don't think I'm necessarily able to answer any questions so much as raise them. But I do know that fear of other teachers, especially finding out, or other students finding out, is a major obstacle when it comes to students being afraid of talking to their counselors. And we've heard stories of school counselors that did tell other teachers, and then the teachers said something about it in class in front of other students, and that was like devastating for the student in question. At the same time, we talk to students from across the country, so I'm not trying to point any fingers there. If there are worst stories out there, we probably hear them, because we hear a lot of really sad stories here. Yeah. So what other questions have come in while I was talking here? I don't know that I can necessarily see everything.
Well, one additional question that I think, one of the big reasons that we added this webinar to the schedule this year is the premiere of season 2 of 13 Reasons Why. Do you have any specific advice or guidance around, dealing with that show specifically, or could you share some examples of how that show has impacted students and ways that we can help our students? Because I know my nieces binged season 1 in a single night last summer before we even knew it was out there.
Yeah.
And they were at the time 11 and 13. So what can we do with this show that's kind of out there, and it's the end of the school year? It's kind of a hard time for us to be letting all of our kids go for the summer, and yet know that this big show that has this big impact is now out there again.
Yes, absolutely. So number one, there is a positive effect. It's not the only effect. There's a lot of negative effects, but first, the positive one is that it's breaking down a little bit of that barrier for talking about suicide. So this can be a good way of opening the door to having those conversations, especially in a class. If there are classes at your school that are like a personal development class, or something to that effect, where it's already part of the curriculum to talk about relationships and emotions and mental health and things like that, it's a wonderful opportunity to have a discussion where you can hear students' reactions to the film and try to get a feel for where students are in the class, to try to pick out the ones who might be thinking about suicide, and also demonstrate that you are a safe person to talk to about it. As far as downsides of the series go, Britt, have you personally seen it?
I watched season 1 last year. I have not watched season 2 yet.
Yeah, I haven't watched season 2 yet.
I'm sure I'll tackle it this summer, but I haven't done it yet.
Yeah. A couple of big downsides. One, it's graphic. So there's the disturbing and possibly triggering nature of that. But number two, it also it presents this suicide and the aftermath of the suicide from a somewhat fantasy point of view. It's not uncommon, especially for teenagers, to have thoughts like, this will teach them, this will show them. Which, if somebody is thinking about suicide and their motivation for suicide is to try to make a point to somebody else, that doesn't mean that they won't attempt it. You know, they may be trying to get attention, like literally, but that doesn't mean that they aren't willing to attempt suicide. In the show, the girl who died by suicide ended up getting to have the last word and getting to affect everybody else's emotions even after her death. So it kind of plays into that fantasy of, this will show them, this will teach them. I don't recommend you making that part of the conversation that you have with students, but when you think of it from that perspective, you can listen for the kinds of things that students say about the show, to see if they are identifying with that, because that might put them at higher risk. I think that a show like this being in the public eye, and we've seen this actually before, that when there is a suicide in the media, it can have the effect of raising the suicide rate, or it can have the effect of reducing the suicide rate depending on what the conversation is that follows it. Is it used as an excuse to tell people about things like the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, to start those conversations where it's okay for somebody to admit that they've thought about suicide, where it's going to be safe for people to talk about it? Or is it going to be the sort of thing that just makes somebody think about the possible, I hate to say it this way, the effects that it's going to have on other people, that kind of glamorizes it. And I don't want that to imply that it shouldn't be talked about, because ultimately this is easy for kids to watch. It's also incredibly easy for kids to get into conversations about it on the internet already. So if it's going to be glamorized, it's already being glamorized, and there isn't anything that you can do as a school that would make that worse. So as a school, I think that there's only good things that can come out of having these conversations with students. Yeah. Oh, were you about to say something, Britt?
I was just gonna kind of, the next question, recommendations for reaching out to parents about the show and these topics, because I think that, you know, definitely there are certain aspects of it that we can't talk about in school, but should be thought about in the process, like you just mentioned. But are those things maybe we can relay to parents that they can talk about, or other things that parents should be aware of, and that we can help facilitate at home?
Excellent question. First of all, if parents are willing to be involved, that is such a wonderful thing. So the sheet that I'm going to send you guys that has the additional information about those key 4 things is something that you can send out to parents, that you can have available in the office for parents to just pick up if they're concerned about their student, if they're concerned about their kid or anybody in their life. Also, if you were to send a message to parents in general, particularly about the show, I would recommend the parents watching the show with their kids so that they can talk about some of these things and so that they know what's actually happening in the show, rather than the kids having their own reaction privately and not talking to people about it. Yeah. Does that answer the question that you had regarding parents? Or
Yeah, I think that is good. Talking points for parents, resources for parents.
Yeah. And also making available the information for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, Iowa Crisis Chat, and any other services that exist in your mental health region that will help with teenagers. In particular, I had a conversation relatively recently with a parent who's concerned about a teenager that they feared was having thoughts of suicide. And I talked about the chat service, and the parent said, "Oh, and then you'll tell us exactly what they say." And I said, "No, we can't. If we told parents what the kids say, they'd stop coming." And the parent said, "Well, then what good is the service?" And I know that a lot of people think that way as parents, myself included. I have a 13-year-old son, and if he was thinking about suicide, I would absolutely want to know more than anything else. And I support school counselors telling parents. The thing that I want to say about the services that are anonymous is that we get so many young people who talk to us who tell us that if an anonymous service wasn't available, they wouldn't talk to anybody at all. And being able to talk to somebody is a very, very big thing. And we can also help them come up with self-care plans and other things that will help them stay safe, even if they aren't talking to somebody in their own life. So yes, being connected to people in person is a wonderful thing. It's a great thing. I highly, highly, highly encourage it. There are going to be some students who aren't willing to admit to people who they know in their own lives that they're thinking about suicide. And so at least there is this other way of reaching them and giving them that outlet to talk. Yeah. Another thing that I want, two things really, that I want to stress the importance of. So there's two trainings that are widely available about suicide. One is going to be more helpful for teachers and parents probably than counselors because it's not that in-depth. It's QPR, question, persuade, refer. So if you can have a training at your school for teachers and or parents who are interested, it teaches people to ask directly about suicide, to listen to somebody's story, and then to get them to some kind of support. There's another training that's more in-depth called Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training, or ASSIST. That's a 2-day training that trains people to do the entire intervention, even if there isn't somebody else that you can refer somebody to. And still, you don't need to be a professional to take the training. It starts from the most basic level and then works up from there. But there's a lot that can be learned in that one, even if you are a professional, even if you've had counseling training already. So that is something that I very highly recommend if this is an area that interests you that you want to be able to help students with. And one thing I'll show you specifically, actually I don't have an image of it on my computer. I was going to show you, they have a chart of a SAFE plan with specific questions like, as an example, has this person ever attempted suicide before? And if the person has attempted suicide before, then what are the things that we can use specifically based on that information to help the person stay safe now? Like asking the person, what has kept you alive? What's kept you from attempting suicide again since that day? And those can be things that you can then weave into the person's SAFE plan to help keep them safe from here on. SAFE plans are awesome, important things, but also I knew they were fit into an hour-long presentation. So if you want to learn more about that kind of stuff, that's just an example of the kinds of things that that are in that applied suicide intervention skills training. If you're interested in doing that, there's I think 11 or 12 trainers in the state of Iowa who can do that training, and I can send that link to Britt as well if you are interested in having that training. LivingWorks is the company that created applied suicide intervention skills training, and this is what their website looks like. Okay, so are there any other questions?
That is everything that has come in.
Okay, awesome.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time, and we will definitely get all of the resources that Sarah has mentioned together and put with the recording on the ISCA and the ICAN websites, and I will also send a specific email to those that attended today. So again, thank you for taking the time to visit with us today and to talk about this important topic. Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and resources with this group. And if you are listening to this as a recording, feel free to reach out to Sarah and her group for more information. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.